Hey, I'm excited to make a start of our workshop today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. And welcome to our workshop on sustaining healthy communities. This is part of the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework. It's our custom in Australia and important for us to do so. We acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where we're meeting today. I'm on Kaurna country, so this is the traditional unceded lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respect to elders past and present, and we do it in a spirit of reconciliation and acknowledging that social and cultural determinants of health and identity, belonging and kinship and connection to country are as important to health and well-being today as ever. And I also acknowledge the traditional lands and custodians of those lands, wherever you might be, here in Australia or around the world. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I'd also just like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and First Nations people joining us online today. The session today brings together industry, research, government, community stakeholders from both Australia and India to explore how we can shape the future of healthy, sustainable communities, advancing a vision in both countries. Today's session is designed to be collaborative and discussion-driven, so your insights will directly shape the direction of the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework and help us to identify where partnerships can have the most impact. We'll start with a brief overview of the Research Collaboration Framework, followed by some presentations from invited speakers, both from India and Australia. And we'll move into some breakout groups to have a more detailed discussion about how we can promote, support, and translate research. Just to start us off, I'd like to introduce myself and my colleagues. As facilitators of the workshop today, the three of us bring together an allied health and public health perspective on sustaining healthy communities. It means that we value population-focused and intersectoral actions that bring people and communities together. And through our work, we demonstrate a commitment to fairness, justice, and promote human rights. My name is Emma George. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Adelaide. Here, I'm the Program Director for Occupational Therapy. I'm also the Australian Delegate to the World Federation of Occupational Therapists. My PhD was in public health, so I sit across this allied health, public health research world. And most of my research is on participation and inclusion and working with marginalised people and communities, both here in Australia and in India. I've had the pleasure of working with my colleagues, Professor Shailaja Tetali and Professor Nathan Grills, who are Shailaja is the co-lead with me on this research theme. And we were introduced to each other by Professor Nathan Grills with work that we've done together. But I'll invite Shailaja and Nathan to also introduce themselves. Shailaja.
Thank you, Emma, and good morning to everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining this workshop. It's very exciting to be part of this workshop myself and being the co-lead with Dr. Emma George. Emma and I have worked together for many years, again, introduced by Professor Nathan Grills, and so thank you, Nathan, for that. It's been very nice working with Emma as well as the Australia-India this group itself, where Emma and Nathan have been huge pillars of support for us in our work as well. When Nathan and myself and Emma worked on various things, the key things that we worked on were disability, virtue care, as well as occupational justice. So I'm at the Indian Institute of Public Health, Hyderabad, which is part of the Public Health Foundation of India. I'm a professor here as well as the Dean of Research. And I work on various sectors within the public health field. I've worked with communities as well as groups in non-communicable diseases, in first response trainings, in injury prevention, as well as disability. So thank you again for joining us, and over to Emma.
Thanks. I'll hand over to Nathan for an introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and thank you, Shailaja. It's great to be with everyone today. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm a professor of global health at the University of Melbourne, working with the Nossal Institute for Global Health. I also have a role as the health lead for research for the Australia India Institute. I'd like to thank them for supporting the program today. and Priya as well for bringing it together. I also work with the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry Health Sciences as their academic director for India engagement. Then I have a lot of people pay my part-time salaries. Other one is working with the Melbourne Disability Institute at the University of Melbourne. So I work largely in disability with a focus on South Asia and India. I've been working with the Indian government for a while on developing training programs, and then working with academic institutes and also NGOs to research disability inclusion and barriers to disability inclusion. And more recently, as Emma was highlighting, with the Virtue Care project to look at how you make virtual healthcare services inclusive of people with disability. I'm a clinician by background as well, so I still work a little bit clinically. And I personally have a personal interest in disability, given my daughter has a profound disability, and that is a big part of my life and motivation for what I do in the disability space. Other work I do is more around community health and development, and looking at networks and partnerships. My PhD was on networking and partnerships in the Indian context, and that's why I introduced people like Shailaja and Emma. I'd like to bring people together to have a bigger impact.
Thanks, Nathan. I'd like to now introduce Associate Professor Haripriya Rangan, Principal Consultant of Government Projects at the Australia-India Institute. Priya will take us through an overview of the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework, which underpins today's thematic workshop. Thanks, Priya.
Thank you, Emma. And I'm happy with the brief introduction. I basically oversee all the government projects that we do in relation to education and research. This is a very exciting and important project that we're doing, the AIRC, the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework. It builds on the work that we've done, Australia-India Institute has done in the past in getting a sense of the extent to which our collaborations across the two countries has been evolving. We produced a compendium on higher education collaborations between the two countries in 2023, and you'll find a link in the chat, which you can open up and look at the report. And essentially, over the past 15 to 20 years, the research collaborations have grown enormously between the two countries, and the researchers are now much more aware of each other's research expertise and so on. But still, there's a lot more work to be done. Last year, we produced a report on research collaborations between Australian and Indian researchers, but we looked at it through the lens of the SDGs, and just so that we could get a sense of how the research collaborations were mapping across these SDGs. And a very interesting thing that came out of it was the high proportion of health-related research that was going on between the two countries. So we're very excited that we actually have this opportunity now to build on these sort of research that we've done, and to actually now look at the framework in a more systematic way of how do we use a framework to expand the research connections, deepen it, how do we address some of the questions and challenges. Now, this little arch is just a kind of a sketch that we've put together at the Institute to give you a sense of how that relationship, what are Australian and Indian researchers resting on or depending on when they do engage. I mean, there's the broad-based foundation of the Australia-India bilateral cooperation through various kinds of agreements like the comprehensive strategic partnership and economic agreements and so on. And then the Australia-India Education and Skills Council. And above that, you have the different ministries on either side, their national research priorities, the bilateral research priorities and programs that they have. For example, one long-standing example is that the Australia-India Strategic Research Funds, but there are other kinds of programs. Then you have industry and government and social sector, the NGO sector being involved. And then universities themselves have various research centers and consortia, and they have their own support systems. And it's on that basis that Australian and Indian researchers kind of have the means to collaborate. Now, every thematic area has its own set of priorities and interests. And so in that arch, in the curve of the arch where the collaborative activities are taking place, we have left it blank because we expect every, like, for example, sustainable, sustaining healthy communities will have their own agenda and their own needs for particular kinds of things that they need for interaction, the things that they do, and then what kinds of support would be needed from from many of these different stakeholders to produce a range of impacts. And we've given you examples in the middle of the arch of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. So in the center, the keystone of the arch is Arch India. If you haven't yet encountered Arch India, it's a platform that was hosted and run by the Australia-India Institute, managed by it. And it's a platform that seeks to connect Australian and Indian researchers. And I would encourage every one of you who hasn't yet checked out the platform to please check it out and register and become part of it. Also, we have a link, I think, for the SDG report. So please take a look at that report also. And so what we'd also like for you to think about all of these things is how you might use that Arch India platform. Where can it become useful in your sets of activities, and how Australia India Institute can facilitate some of those engagements that are required. So those are the sorts of things that we hope you will be able to discuss today. So thank you for that, and over back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Priya. To set the scene a little bit for us before we launch into our key speakers, I wanted to offer a brief introduction to our research theme on sustaining healthy communities. This theme is one of 4 research themes within the framework. The other themes are energy transition and climate change resilience, advancing manufacturing technologies, and cybersecurity and digital governance. So sustaining healthy communities does have a different flavour, I think, which is exciting for us as co-leads of the research theme. The workshop today is really designed to facilitate discussion so we can learn more about social and cultural determinants of health and the importance of sustaining healthy communities as a way to address health inequities. We know that back in 2008, the WHO Commission on Social Determinants highlighted those avoidable differences in health and life expectancy, and they're largely due to conditions in which people live, grow, work, play, learn. This year in May, in 2025, the WHO's report on social determinants of health equity tells us that despite global consensus that social determinants must be tackled, progress has been insufficient. Global advancement and improvements have been inconsistent, and some inequalities are widening. Action areas identified by the WHO include structural determinants such as economic systems, social infrastructure, discrimination, conflict, and megatrends like climate change and digitalisation. In our workshop today, we can't unpack them all, but we can bring our attention to what this means for sustaining healthy communities. So I wanted to share with you, this is the operational framework for monitoring social determinants of health equity. And as I read through the report earlier this year, I was drawn to so many different examples of what this means for both Australia and India. And I'll highlight 3 for you, not because I'm anywhere near an expert in these, but just to show how a theme could be cross-cutting across both countries. So I want to talk very briefly about food security, road safety, and access to healthcare. If we think about food security. In Australia, food insecurity is not always measured consistently, and the estimates suggest that between 4 and 13% of the general population face material hardship, inadequate financial resources, lack of access to affordable, healthy food, often due to geographical distance, and there's limited food and nutrition literacy. For some Indigenous populations, this increases to 22 to 32% of the population, depending on location, particularly remoteness. Policy interventions include local community collaboration, emergency food and relief initiatives, school-based programs, and education. In comparison, my work in India has taught me that for some daily wage labourers, food is not always the highest priority, and often workers will go without vegetables, surviving on just rice and chutney, so that they can also pay for medicine, transport, or education. So the context might be different, but there are cross-cutting themes around food insecurity, I think. If we think about road safety, 1,200 people die in Australia on the roads every year, over 12,000 in the last decade, with 375,000 people seriously injured. The overall cost of road crashes to the Australian economy is estimated to be over $300 billion. The new strategy for road safety focuses on safe roads, safe vehicles, and safe road use, with targets that by 2030, fatalities will be reduced by 50% and serious injuries reduced by 30%. But the number of road fatalities in India is hard to comprehend. Officially in 2021, there were over 150,000 people killed in road crashes, corresponding to 11.3 deaths per 100,000. And the numbers are climbing each year, with more vehicles on the road and with trucks and buses involved in 70% of fatal crashes in both rural and urban areas. And I know that there's a lot of collaboration between the two countries, particularly on medical interventions and surgery and rehabilitation as well following injury. And then thinking about access to healthcare, we know that equitable and culturally safe and responsible care is complex. As we've mentioned previously, Professor Nathan Grills led a recent project on virtual healthcare and accessibility for people with disabilities in India. In that project that the three of us all worked on, we learned that despite the rapid rollout of virtual care in India, specifically through telehealth, we learned that unless healthcare is intentionally designed to be inclusive for people with disabilities like vision impairment, hearing impairment, or cognitive impairment, as well as others, that the benefits of innovation may not be sustainable. Realising the potential of virtual care requires addressing technological, systemic, and policy gaps while fostering participatory approaches and ensuring compliance with international accessibility standards. Other research that I'm involved in here in Australia on access to disability services through the National Disability Insurance Scheme shows that while the policy is built on a rights perspective and the importance of choice and control, first time as well as ongoing access to the scheme still has many barriers. So I offer these three examples, not as an expert in the three of them, but just to show you the opportunities that we see perhaps for collaboration and shared learning across both countries. What does it have to do with sustaining healthy communities? Well, from our public and allied health backgrounds, we know that the social and community contexts encompass many determinants of health, and solutions to health inequities require intersectoral action and opportunities for health in all policies. Research that helps us build and sustain healthy communities has implications for policy and benefits to populations globally. As facilitators, our perspective aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we acknowledge that while we offer expertise as health professionals and academics, we don't know what we don't know beyond this into areas like agriculture, engineering, law. So we do want to hear from all of you so that we can develop strategies and recommendations for this Australia-India research collaboration framework. We want to seek input from you on ways that we can promote, support, and translate the research. Promoting the research includes the encouragement of developing new interdisciplinary research collaborations. To support research, we want to sustain and strengthen partnerships over time, ensuring they remain impactful and mutually beneficial. And to translate the research, we want to establish pathways to apply research into practical outcomes, and ultimately engagement with partners. So this is why we open up discussion with you, and as we invite our key speakers to share their experience and knowledge, we'll then also discuss specific examples from our own work and why we want to champion healthy communities. What we have in store for you today is divided into 2 sessions. We're starting with invited presentations, and in a minute I'll hand over to Shailaja to introduce our speakers. After both have presented, we'll have an opportunity for some discussion or online feedback if you prefer. And then after a very short break, we'll have a focused discussion with 2 examples and to talk through some guided discussion questions on how we might promote, support and translate our ideas. We encourage you to participate in the workshop today. We're really keen to hear from you as well as we'll share our experience with you. But I'll hand over to Shailaja to introduce our first speaker.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Our first speaker is Dr. Shailaja Rao Seshadri, who is Professor and Director of the Ramalinga Swamy Center for Equity and Social Determinants of Health at the Public Health Foundation of India, Bengaluru. Over to you, Dr. Shailaja, for your presentation, please.
Oh, I'll just stop my share.
Yeah. Thank you, Shailaja, Emma, and others for inviting me to speak at this session. Many of the things I heard Emma, you mentioning earlier were really resonated with me and the kind of work that I've been doing for some years. And today I will give a very brief overview, not to take up too much time. Talking about some work that I've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years amongst the Shailaja tribal community in southern Karnataka, and talking about food sovereignty and the challenges that they've had in terms of the transitions in their traditional food system and how it's impacting their sense of flourishing or well-being. So just a quick overview on who the Shailajas are. They are a forest-dwelling tribe in South Karnataka, and traditionally, of course, they've been engaging in shifting cultivation, foraging in the forests, and they used to do a bit of hunting as well, as and when they needed. They also had traditional fire practices with which they controlled the forest environment, and particularly the invasive species within the forest. Now, the thing is that in 1974, this area where they live, which is the Biligiri Rangana Hills in South Karnataka, were declared a wildlife reserve. And as a result of that, and then later on they were called tiger, they've been renamed a tiger reserve more recently. And as a result, their access to the forest and also the things that they can do in the forest have been severely curtailed. And so, this is a perfect example of how, what is good for one particular sector is actually having a very detrimental impact on the other. And there hasn't been much coordination or conversation between the two. And so what has happened is that the Shailajas largely have been resettled outside the forest, and they have been given lands to do settled agriculture, which is not part of their traditional food system at all. And because of this change in their relationship with the forest, and they are no longer allowed to hunt in the forest, and they're no longer allowed to use a fire as a way of controlling, what grows in the forest. Several very detrimental things have happened. One is that there has been a huge proliferation of animals, including, small animals. Of course, the tigers are also growing in number, which is great. But also other animals are growing. And so crop depredation in their farms has increased tremendously. And so they are shifting away from food crops to cash crops because animals don't attack those as much. The other thing that's happened is that an invasive species called lantana has overtaken the forest. And so a lot of the food that they do have access to go and gather is actually getting smothered by the lantana. So there's very little, I would say that the production has dropped dramatically. And instead, what has happened is that government food subsidies and the market are becoming their main source of food, whereas earlier the forest used to be the main source of food. So just to quickly go over, the role that forests and farming used to play in their food and nutrition. There was non-timber forest produce that they used to collect. There was ecological and cultural diversity that was associated with the forest. I mean, the trees were worshipped by the Soligas and so on. They had traditional practices around how they used fire, and that had impacted the conservation of the forest quite positively in the past. Their traditional agriculture was shifting, and they used to have animal husbandry also located in the forest. And there was a lot of traditional knowledge and practice and cultural richness that was associated with this farming and the practices that were located within their traditional farming practices. And then, of course, there was a huge dietary diversity because of that, because we did a listing of the different kinds of greens that they used to eat. And there was something like 27 different greens that they could name. And there were many that they ate without having any particular name for them. Whereas now they are reduced to 3 or 4 that they can buy in the market. And so, that's just one example of the way in which their diet has actually transformed over the last 20 or 30 years. So it raises some questions as to how do they access food, what is now their demand for different kinds of food, how has it changed, how do these changes affect their nutrition? From the National Family Health Survey, for example, we're finding that the divergence between the common nutritional outcomes like stunting, wasting, and underweight that are measured amongst children 0 to 5, there's a substantial gap between tribal children and non-tribal children. The data for this particular group is not available, although we are working on measuring that as well. But generally across the country, this is the situation that we are facing. And what about the interventions by the state? And this brings me to the issue that Emma was mentioning earlier about food security. And the government's programs have been aimed at reducing food insecurity. And so that is measured in terms of calories. And the public distribution system basically goes beyond, provides food subsidies to the extent where it is meeting the calorific needs of that family on a daily basis. But that has translated into an extremely carbohydrate-rich or heavy subsidy, because most of it is composed of rice. So each family gets about 35 kilos of rice a month, but not much more than that. It gets, where possible, a little bit of lentils, a little bit of oil, and some sugar, which actually is not required. But it's mainly the rice. And this is the approach to food justice, in the sense that this kind of subsidy does give people access to some food, which they perhaps wouldn't have had access to in the absence of the food subsidy program. But what about nutritional security? And more importantly, what happens to the idea of food sovereignty, where communities had control over the kind of food that they were growing and eating, and where the production and consumption of food were co-located. At this point, the production and consumption of food have moved very far apart. and it has implications for more than just the nutritional outcomes. Because what we also did was measure what we call flourishing, and we did this through a flourishing index, and I can share the reference for that. And essentially, that flourishing index measured people's sense of well-being. It is self-reporting on things such as happiness, life satisfaction, their sense of meaning or purpose, their idea of their own character and their value and virtue, and how they were able to maintain close relationships. And here is where we found a very interesting set of observations, which was the Soligas. There are 4 different types of forests over there. The scrub forest is the one which is closest to the general population, where people have a lot of opportunities for different kinds of livelihood, and where incomes are quite high, but they also are very far divorced from their traditional environment. And then you have the evergreen forest, where people actually live deep inside the forest. It's very difficult to find them. And they live perhaps as close to their traditional lifestyle as any of the other Soligas. And we found that the sense of flourishing, despite the fact that they had less income and less access to food subsidies, etc., was highest amongst those living in the evergreen forest and lowest amongst those living in the scrub forest. So what does this tell us about the relationship of the Soligas to their environment, and what it means in terms of their ability to maintain their traditional food systems and their traditional way of life? I think that was very interesting, and we want to explore that much more. So, in conclusion, my time, I know, is running out, I'm sorry. Preserving traditional food systems seems to be one of the key pathways to maintaining a sustainable society. And this is not only important for nutritional outcomes, but also for the sense of well-being and the sense of flourishing of that community. So I think what would be very interesting would be to understand these pathways and determinants and drivers of subjective well-being. And how does this translate across cultures? Are there some, core concepts here that are worth looking at and trying to understand that are relevant to all people everywhere? And is it something that people have, that you all have seen in your work as well? And then we are trying to also figure out how to support and promote, sustainable and traditional food systems. And so we are trying to develop, of course, policy papers and so on to discuss with the government, but also trying to create, other artifacts like recipe books. We've created a game to help young children now understand at school what it means to have your traditional food sources taken away, and how do you cope with that, and what can you do as an alternative? Is that something that we can work on as well collaboratively? And also, what are some of the opportunities? I know that in India, there is increasing opportunity for looking at particularly nutritional outcomes, because the SDGs, are very, the government of India is very committed to them, and the nutritional indicators are clipping. And particularly for indigenous communities, there is a great deal of precarity that we're looking at. So, how can we help and work together to try and not only increase our understanding, but also develop new interventions that would perhaps help to address this very urgent problem. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shailaja, for that wonderful presentation, and also for encouraging us to think about the changes in the food system through your experience, as well as its consequences, and to encourage us to think about exploring further collaborations in this area. Thank you. We'll come back to you with questions, etc. While we move on to our next speaker, who is Associate Professor Tamara McKean. Associate Professor McKean is a Walian woman, an Aboriginal public health medicine physician, and Associate Professor of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Public Health Research with the College of Medicine and Public Health. She is also the inaugural research lead, Indigenous Research Strategy, with the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research at Flinders University. Over to you, Professor McKean, for your talk.
Thank you so much. Let's hope I can make the technology work for me. So I hope that is working for everybody. Fabulous, thank you.
Yes.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks to Emma for inviting me to be a part of this seminar today. And I would also like to add my acknowledgements to the First Peoples of this country, and particularly the Kaurna peoples, the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains area. I've been living and working in Adelaide this time around for 13 years, and I feel very honoured to be in Kaurna country on a daily basis and enjoy the beautiful place that is Adelaide. I won't reintroduce my professional background, but I will say that I've specialised in public health medicine. I don't practice clinically anymore, and I have a very broad spectrum of public health research that I do. And I'm going to give some sort of overall contextual comments to start with, and then I'm going to draw on a few of the research pieces that I've been involved with in recent times, and hopefully share them with you all as food for thought and things that perhaps we can have greater discussion on as we go along. Do keep an eye on me for the time and wave or interrupt if I'm getting a bit out of time. I wanted to share first up my country. So I'm a Walian woman. This is the northeast region of the goldfields of Western Australia, a place called Laverton, up northeast of Kalgoorlie. This place was a ration depot, a place called Lyndon, and a range of different Aboriginal clan groups became beholden to this space for food as part of colonisation and control processes of the British when they invaded this country. This was the second time only that I had been to my home country, and it underscored to me the really significant relationship we as people have with place, and particularly Walian people have with Walian country. And that country to many First Peoples is alive and breathing and is part of our family. And it's not necessarily a resource or an entity solely for what it can produce for human beings. And I think that reorientation to place is an important step we need to take as citizens, given our current climate challenges that we face, but also the challenges that we have in terms of making sure that we leave a country that's inhabitable, that's livable, not just for our grandchildren, but for their grandchildren and their grandchildren. So just a potted Australian history, because not entirely sure what people's understanding is, and so this is very much from my perspective as a Walian person. So at the moment, the science sits between around 60 to 80,000 years that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have occupied this continent, Australia. Over that time, they developed quite extensive trade routes, north, south, east, west, and everything in between. And what I think is really, really critical now is that in the southern part of our country, near the South Australia-Victoria border, they are looking at some sites of significance and think that there's potential for human occupation upwards of 100,000 years, and that would really change the way in which we think about human population and movements of human beings around the globe. Not many people realise that the Dutch came and interacted with this continent and mapped part of this continent in the 1600s. And the Macassans, what is now modern day Indonesia, had long-standing relationship with the top end of Australia in both trade as well as in families and marriage. And there are Aboriginal descendants living today in various parts of Indonesia that came together because of these relationships between what were fishermen and traditional peoples on the coast. And that was around Tripang, the sea cucumber. So these interactions of an international nature were happening in this country before the British arrived. So the British arrived in 1788, and I think it is challenging for some to acknowledge that that was an invasion. There was not a peaceful settlement of this country. It was established through war, it was established through dispossession, and it was established through genocide. The initial intent of the purpose of this place was twofold. One, what sort of resources are there? And two, can we use this as a penal colony? And that then started, the first significant wave of migration to this country was British military and convicts. Australia did not come into being until 1901, which is when we were federated. And then we also have a range of territories, but two territories on mainland Australia, the Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is, and the Northern Territory, so Darwin down through to Alice Springs. Over that period of 100 plus years, there have been some really significant changes for the society that we live in. The economic base has changed substantially. This place was established through slave labour that included both First Peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also convicts. As time went on and things moved about, pastoralism became quite big. And there's a phrase that, Australia grew up on the back of the sheep, and so wool was one of our biggest exports, primarily back to Europe in the first days. And then over time in Australia, we've had this increasing minerals and increasing mining, increasing tourism, and a real decrease in manufacturing. And we make very little here now, even though we have raw ingredients for it. And then in more recent times, what it is that we bring to the global stage in terms of renewables has also picked up. We've had significant demographic changes, originally First Peoples, then the British, but more recently we've had a lot more immigrants, and we've been able to take refugees. There was a really big push on immigration post-World War II in this country, and so we do have a substantial number of our current population that were either born of migrants, so their parents were migrated here, or they themselves migrated here. So there's a large multiculturalism in this country that is actually long-standing, but is also sometimes resisted, and we've seen that happening very recently. Our biggest environmental challenges have been about the way we've used our land. We've gone from having a very well-established ecosystem with things like fire management and land management fish traps, aquaculture, quite sophisticated aquaculture, and, you know, very large tracts of pasture type land, and a lot of native flora and fauna from which to draw food and other resources from. So all of that literally stopped when the British arrived, and that change of using land as a resource has had significant impacts in this country, not just in terms of our food, but in terms of our water. So we have the Murray-Darling Basin, and at the moment in South Australia, where the mouth of the Murray comes out, we're actually having some very interesting issues with the fertilizers and the silt and everything that is coming down from other places further up in recent years. And then in less recent, but still recent years, we've had problems where the mouth of the Murray has nearly closed over because so much water's been taken out at the top end of the river. So we've not managed our waterways very well. We've not necessarily managed our land very well, and lack of ongoing traditional practice, particularly with fire management, has been linked to some of the really quite extreme weather events that we've had, including massive bushfires and substantial flooding. And quite sadly, we have lost our native species, we've lost our biodiversity, and that is still happening and has implications for the way in which we move forward. I've got to go quickly, sorry. I won't linger too long on here because others have already touched on here. For us in Australia, we need the structures and our processes that are actually geared towards public good rather than private or corporate good. And that has been a challenge for many nations around the globe, but we're seeing what the idea of privatisation is actually doing to our social fabric and our cohesiveness, as well as the way in which we're creating greater gaps between those with and those without. Where there are healthy communities, there is connected governance. This is an inclusive way of being, to be able to get local, regional, as well as broader national kind of ways of decision making, priority setting, and resource allocation. Easier said than done. In Australia, our federation system didn't give us connected governance. It gave us chunks of governments that don't always connect with each other. We do need to have accessible services and accessible goods. And those services include the social determinants, but also technology. Things have changed rapidly. And we look at Australia, it's a big country, and we need to be able to connect with people at different points in time, and we need to be able to make technology work for us to do that. We've got goods. I've put knowledge in as a good because what we've ended up is not necessarily having free access to knowledge about things like food, about things like water, about things like governance. So we actually need to reorientate the way in which we arm people with knowledge about how they can take action for themselves, but also for their family and the community in which they are living in, that leads to health and well-being. We've got a real need to invest in our families and children. And I'm not sure if everyone is aware of some of the major challenges we're having looking at what's going on with our early child care sector. So we've built up a whole sector around early childhood care, and that in more recent times, we've really got questions about, well, how well is that nurturing and holding our children for the future? That concept of having a positive sense of self, but a positive sense of others, is being really challenged at the moment. We've got disunity and disparities, which makes it very hard for people to be able to engage as human beings with one another. We engage with us and them. We engage with those with and without. So it's It's a shift in our thinking that we need to explicitly do in order to achieve things like equity. So just quickly from the research that I've done, the hyperlinks should work, and I'll send them to the team in University of Melbourne. So this is just some examples of the work to date. So when I first met Emma, it was in the conduct of the first project, which was looking at health equity and public policy. Policy is important. It's not some dry, disconnected thing. It sets our parameters. It's in response to priorities, and it dictates where resources go, and that includes funding, money, as well as other resources. There's a piece that we've pulled out of that, which is a piece I worked on looking at the cultural safety of Australian public policy. And this is something that may be useful in terms of looking at the way that policy is done so that it maintains coherency when it's implemented, and so it achieves the intent of what the policy is about. This particular paper is looking at the way in which that can be done in a culturally safe fashion so that it meets the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But we've also got some interesting work in public health around things like health in all policies. And I believe our thinking needs to be extended in that way. No policy is in isolation. All policies affect all other policies. So we need to have some far more connected thinking about the way in which we get policy to work for equity. The next one is around the history of community health in this country and looking at social movements, particularly things that happened in the 60s and 70s around women's health centres and also community health centres namely in Victoria, and the Aboriginal community controlled health movement. The Aboriginal community controlled health movement is a really positive example of self-determination in health and healthcare, and what it is to empower local people in governance, but also in service provision. The paper that I've got there shows that history, and it also gives ideas as to what does this mean for us into the future if we want to have community-orientated service provision that is run by community for community. I've also got a big interest in the food. I think the food is so key. We have, at the moment in this country, 14% of our agricultural land is owned by foreign interests. We need to be really clear about food sovereignty being how a nation can feed its people healthy, good food that keeps them well and keeps them able to participate in life. I really think we're missing the boat on this one. We've got multiple big food interests at play, and we need to probably come back to some basic principles about being able to feed our own people. This is particularly important because in this country, we have food products that are drought tolerant, that require minimal water, that are highly nutritious, high in protein, and good for things like chronic disease, including diabetes. For example, native grain flour, the eating of it has a better glycemic response. So we've got some of the answers already, and we need to actually look at mobilising what they mean for our future food production. And the last one is around decolonising primary healthcare. It does sit looking at the Aboriginal community controlled health sector, but more broadly looking at primary healthcare for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we've published recently in the Medical Journal of Australia on a definition of decolonising primary healthcare. And the reason I share it with you is to get people thinking about how do we reorientate notions of power? How do we reorientate notions of being able to be patient-centred and to be rights-based and to be looking at working a way forward out of some pretty difficult and complex health disparities working our way forward from a strengths-based perspective. So I'll end with that definition. I'll put that up as my last slide, which basically says that decolonising practice is led for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around their own ways of knowing, being and doing, that it consciously and explicitly breaks down systemic racism. It challenges the power imbalances, and those are particularly extreme for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. It acknowledges and addresses white privilege, and this is something that can be quite uncomfortable for people to engage with, and fundamentally is strengths-based and provides a way forward that sees us as having value in terms of what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but as well as those working with us, the value of those ways of working can be, in this sense, for a health system. But I also think there are other ways in which we could perhaps better harness our different knowledge systems in ways that create national value and create, a better sense of us when it comes to our social fabric. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor McKean, for your lovely talk, as well as making us think about the significance of the link between people and place, as well as for sharing your learnings from the Indigenous public health research. So this brings us to a close of the session of the expert presentations, and I'll hand it over to Emma now. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just get my slide back up. I'm going to invite Nathan to just facilitate maybe a 10-minute discussion for us to reflect on what's already been shared in this first session. And I've just highlighted 3 key questions for all of us to consider. And if you'd like to post a comment in the chat or raise your hand and ask a question, but thinking about what's already been shared, and I'll allow Nathan to facilitate this discussion. And for anyone who would like to contribute online, you can scan that QR code there. And I think Brina will also pop the link in the chat if you want to type out some thoughts as well. We're really keen for your feedback, but I'll hand over to Nathan for the next 10 minutes. You're on mute, Nathan.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Professor McKean and Dr. Shishadri. I really enjoyed those presentations. It's opened up a whole lot of questions, I'm sure. And I would like, if everyone has turn your camera on if you can, it'd be great to be able to see your face. And if you want to ask some questions, we'd appreciate it. There's sort of those 3 areas that Emma just referred to. Firstly, if you have any feedback about the presentations, feel free to share your own experiences in this area. Any general feedback, but thinking how we can promote research on sustaining healthy communities, what strategies would encourage interdisciplinary research, highlight shared priorities, and foster collaboration. So looking at promote, that first box there. Then looking, secondly, at support, thinking how we can support research on sustainable, healthy communities, and what we can recommend to sustain and strengthen ongoing partnerships that support engagement and reciprocity. The third area, looking at translation, thinking about how we can translate research on sustaining healthy communities and how we can establish pathways to apply research to practical outcomes. So we're open to any feedback. There's sort of 3 questions to get us thinking. I know it's a bit hard to get thinking at the start, so I might start by actually asking, if it's okay, I might ask Shailaja, Dr. Shishadri, do you have any comments on Professor McKean's talk and how it might relate to your own experience working in India? Do you think there's similarities between the two areas, Indigenous health systems and your experience in nutrition with the Shailaja people?
I thought there were several points that were very interesting. One of the terms that Tamara used, which was placemaking, that is something that we also talk about quite a lot. I work in public health and have worked for 3 decades, but my training is in sociology, and so thinking about issues of how people construct a life of value, and how important placemaking is in that, in the sort of imagination that they bring to it. I think that's very important. We really need to think about how, some of the issues that he was referring to, in terms, of course, decolonization is a thing that we talk about, in terms of an external, external power coming and colonizing the country, but there's also internal colonization that takes place. And the way that, the state views their right to, take over people's land, and also, redirect how and where they're going to live, in the interest of larger objectives that have nothing to do with the interests or the aspirations of the people who actually live in that space, in that place. I think this is something that it takes us out of, takes me out of my public health, realm, but actually is critical for us to engage with. So this idea of having intersectoral, linkages when you're thinking about food, you can't just talk about it in terms of agriculture or food systems particularly. You need to bring in agroecology, you need to bring in politics, you need to bring in all kinds of other, psychology, sociology, all of these disciplines need to sit and work together, I think, to be able to understand, in a holistic way, what is happening to food systems. And I'm coming only from that point of view. I also work on health systems, but I didn't refer to it in this talk. But I think that multidimensionality is very, very critical. And taking a historical approach, it's not that these things happen today. There's a long history to the way certain people have been marginalized and how their precarity has evolved over a period of time. And I appreciate the different ways that that into the talk.
Thank you, Shailaja. Appreciate it. I might flip the question now back to Professor McKean. Just reflecting on Shailaja's talk about Indigenous health systems and nutrition, do you find some similar scenarios in Indigenous communities in Australia?
Yes, well, it wasn't planned, so I didn't know what Shailaja was going to present. The minute that she did start presenting, I was like, yes, these are the similar kind of, issues and solutions. They're coupled together. Fundamentally, what I think both of our presentations touched on is the way in which people are marginalised, but also their knowledge is marginalised, and that is not good, in the sense of we're not engaging with things, knowings that could very much help us move through some of these challenges. There's a degree of arrogance that is actually going to be our own undoing as a society, if we can't get a handle on the fact that there is knowledge systems that are relevant to a contemporary Australia, at least. So, seeing the interconnectedness, the way that Shailaja was presenting it, and the knock-on effects of a decision here and happening over here, that is becoming more and more obvious. And in that clarity, we're also seeing the limits of dominant knowledge systems, like that they don't always enable the joining up of the dots. We get discipline silos. And so being able to look at something like food and nutrition, but take it back to how do we as people interact with food in its fullest sense, then we need to bring all of that information into the space to solve issues around food security, and to really plan and sustain ourselves into the future, thinking about food sovereignty. We need the capacity to feed our own people nourishing, healthy food. It's not rocket science, but we are not doing that. We Australia, sorry, royal we.
Thank you, Tamara. I appreciate those insights.
We'll move on now to the breakout sessions. So we'll move into our first breakout session, focusing on the promote pillar of the AIRC framework, how we can encourage the development of new and interdisciplinary research collaborations. These sessions are interactive, so we encourage really active participation from all of you. Please contribute. Please keep your cameras on and raise your hand if you'd like to share your perspective, or please put it in the chat. Please note that these group discussions are being recorded for internal note-taking only to support the development of the framework. We have two concurrent groups. Group 1 is on climate stress and disaster response, and Group 2 is on health-related infrastructure and environments. In each group, you'll first hear from an expert speaker who will set the stage. And after that, you'll move into discussion around a set of guiding questions that we will project in each group. Once discussions conclude, we will reconvene in the main room to share key insights from each group. Welcome to this Group 1. What we'll do here is we'll look at various insights that come from the discussion and which will help us inform the promote pillar of the AIRC framework. That is how we can encourage the development of new and interdisciplinary research collaboration. Specifically, this particular session aims to explore key stakeholders involved in research collaboration within the theme of sustaining healthy communities, which is the theme of this workshop, as well as exploring their roles in promoting collaboration. We'll also see how to look at best practices and mechanisms that initiate these collaborations. And we'll see what is needed to attract new researchers who are not yet involved in the Australia-India research collaboration. So that's what we will do in Group 1. And now I would like to invite Eliza Huppertz, lecturer in the School of Allied Health Science and Practice at the University of Adelaide, to share a little more about her work before we move into questions. Over to you, Eliza. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Shailaja. Can you see my PowerPoint there?
Yes, Eliza, we can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. At this stage of my presentation, I will acknowledge that I'm presenting on Kaurna land, similar to Emma and Tamara. So across both Australia and India, the prevalence and severity of natural disasters is increasing as a result of climate change. In this breakout group, I'm going to briefly summarise some of my research on disaster recovery in Australia. Just to briefly introduce myself here, I've been working as a lecturer with the University of Adelaide, and alongside esteemed colleagues Rob Pereira, Alison Wicks, Emma George and Gail Whiteford, I've co-authored a number of papers exploring the occupational therapy role in disaster recovery. This research interest came about through my own lived experience of disaster events. In the period of 2019 to 2020, my parents' property was skirted by grass fire in the Adelaide Hills. My partner's family's property in the South Australian Riverland was flooded. My sister was caught in the pandemic lockdowns of Melbourne, and my partner and I experienced a cyclone whilst living in Broome. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing Australian community members' experience of disaster recovery through an analysis of narratives from the bushfires, floods, droughts and COVID-19 that took place around Australia in the period of 2019 to 2022, a period of intense disaster for Australia. The narratives that come from the publication Doing Our Best, Individual and Community Responses to Challenging Times, which is undertaken by Occupational Therapy Australia. To provide some transparency regarding the source of those narratives, a brief outline of the publication's curation processes has been provided on the slide. As part of our research work, we undertook a secondary analysis of this dataset. In the next part of this presentation, I'm briefly going to discuss some of the challenges experienced by community members affected by disaster events. As an occupational therapist, this description is going to include conceptualizations of occupational injustices, but broadly speaks to the lived experiences of Australians impacted by disaster. So across different disaster events, community members clearly described experiences of occupational deprivation or prolonged states in which they were unable to do what was necessary and meaningful in their lives due to external restrictions. I'm going to introduce you to Shafiq, a community member who lives in Canberra and generously shared his narrative as part of OT Australia's project. So the bushfires of 2020 scorched the fringes of Canberra, casting a pall of smoke and uncertainty over the city. And then, as if from the ashes of one calamity, another emerged, the pandemic. With the world plunged into lockdowns and isolation, Shafiq found himself grappling not only with the threat of the virus, but also with the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Shafiq described the challenges associated with restriction from opportunities to do the things meaningful to him after the Australian government introduced social distancing measures to minimise the spread of COVID-19. Home confinement, in his words, social distancing and restrictions of movement meant an inability to see loved ones and the end of plans to travel. These measures, in addition to a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, plunged me into depression and a deep sense of loneliness. Participants also described how the demands of post-disaster recovery process left them over-occupied in some occupations, like cleanup and recovery, and under-occupied in others, or in a state of occupational imbalance. One of the narratives which speaks powerfully to this lived experience is that of Florence, whose property was burnt in a bushfire. Florence resides on a farm northeast of Perth, where wheat and cereals are grown and sheep are raised for their wool. In December 2019, amidst the hustle of the harvest season, a wildfire ravaged their property, leaving destruction in its wake. Whilst homes miraculously survived the fire, the aftermath was a scene of desolation, blackened paddocks, damaged fences, and the pervasive smell of smoke infiltrating homes. With resilience and determination, Florence and her daughter, Jeanette, embarked on the arduous task of cleaning and rebuilding. Here, she describes the enormity of the cleanup task and how the urgency of the disaster event interrupted other meaningful occupations. In her words, "We were devastated. All thoughts of Christmas shopping were abandoned. There was considerable damage to fences, as the first on the scene cut the fences to get to the fire as quickly as possible. Most of our sheds, vehicles, and some machinery were affected. The first thing that we had to do was capture the 5,000 sheep who'd raced away from the fire." So in drought, losses mounted more slowly, with participants describing the gradual disruption to occupations. Participants clearly described a state of occupational alienation, prolonged experiences of disconnectedness, isolation, emptiness, a lack of sense of identity, a limited confinement, expression of spirit, or a sense of meaninglessness. Jo resides in the southern rangelands, where her family operates a pastoral station. Due to the increasing impact of drought exacerbated by global warming, life on the land becomes increasingly challenging. The gradual disappearance of wildlife and vegetation, coupled with the economic strain of lost income from the land, takes a toll on the pastoral community's morale and well-being. Jo discusses the impact of drought on her family's pastoral station. Family members who've worked closely together have to give up. Working off the property becomes the norm, as there's no income possible from the land. Altogether, much that makes pastoralists' daily life meaningful and enjoyable vanishes. I'm now going to touch on some of the stories of recovery, stories that inspire hope in the impacts of community-driven action, stories that speak to the power of social capital. Kieran Radkelly is a third-generation farmer from the wheat farming district of the Millewa, northwest Victoria. 2019 was a really tough drought year. Another farmer, Jeff, had been thinking about organising a cricket match for the locals for several years, and the drought was a trigger to make it happen. He thought it might provide a distraction at a time of the year where everyone would normally be busy harvesting, and a great way to bring everyone together. More than 200 spectators attended the game, including lots of people from Mildura, 80 miles away. Local businesses from Victoria and South Australia sponsored with food, drinks and a prize for Player of the Day. Community members reflect on how it's so great to sit around and share a laugh about things that happened in the past. In Rad's story, we see the power of community-driven action. By getting together, organising an event for their own community, individuals found purpose in very difficult times. Ash Brennan lost his house in the Conjola Park bushfire, which nearly killed his brother and many others who stayed to fight. From a Perth hotel room, Ash saw the first images of what used to be his house in the background of a news report. After almost being wiped off the map, a traumatised community waited for help, but it never came. Conjola was abandoned and left for dead. In recovery, local artists started creating. They needed to heal. It gave the community hope and solidified their journey to recovery together. As a filmmaker, Ash felt he needed to document this process. The community had previously closed its door to all media and said Ash was the one that they entrusted to tell their bushfire stories. Ash felt an enormous responsibility to get it right and to tell the community's stories, not one that necessarily aligned with a TV broadcaster's target audience. The result is a 1-hour documentary, We Are Conjola, Our Fire, Our Story. What makes this film even more special is that it was funded mostly by people who lost their houses. The brave people of Conjola wanted their voices heard. From the obvious questions of climate change and Indigenous land management to the not-so-obvious values of emergency services, the film puts the viewer in the line of fire and asks, what would you do in this situation? In Ash's story, we see the power of social capital. It was the skills of Ash as a community member, as well as the wider community of artists who made the film possible. To close, these narratives remind us that disasters are not just environmental or economic events. They're lived experiences that shape identity, connection, identity, connection, and well-being. Going forward, research can deepen our understanding of how social capital and collective action are mobilised to support disaster resilience. For Australia, India, and other contexts facing frequent and increasing disasters, we can share how storytelling, creative projects, grassroots initiatives foster hope and recovery. At a policy level, findings highlight the need to embed occupational justice into disaster planning and recovery frameworks, ensuring that communities are not only physically rebuilt, but also supported to reconnect, participate, and thrive. Thank you, Shailaja.
Thank you so much, Eliza. That was a wonderful presentation. And thank you for sharing the Australian members' experience of dealing with disasters. And you also presented the narratives, their narratives, challenges, etc. And you also talked about the occupational deprivation and consequences on their economic status, as well as on their mental health. And what I also liked is the stories of recovery, the stories of resilience that you talked about, which showed the power of community-driven action, as well as the power of social capital, everybody coming together during a time of distress. And so basically the power of narratives is what came up very strongly here, and thank you for that.
It's my pleasure to first meet online and introduce our guest speaker for this session, Dr. Shweta Kadam. Dr. Kadam is a director of the Indian Institute of Public Health. He brings 24 years of experience in public health to our workshop today. His PhD was in global health with a focus on resource management. And his research includes health systems, healthcare, financing, human resources, access to healthcare and equity. And I'm very excited to hear what you have to share with us today about health infrastructure. It's really interesting for me, and I look forward to the discussion. We have some guided discussion questions, and so after Dr. Kadam's presentation, we can talk through those, and I'm hoping that they'll pop up in the chat. Otherwise, I will put them up there in a minute. And Dr. Kadam, if you have a presentation to share, hopefully you'll be able to do that as well.
Thank you, Dr. Emma, and thank you all of this. Good morning and good afternoon. I am going to briefly discuss when I saw the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework. So whatever first thought came in my mind, I just put them together in just 3 slides. So I will share with our experience on looking towards research. So I will give 2 examples. First is about I am putting it like evidence generation. Oh no. Evidence generation, then advocacy, and then practice. What we did at Public Health Foundation of India at Indian Institute of Public Health, Bhubaneswar. So evidence generation, what we did is one of our epidemiologists, he, based on the data, he demonstrated the relationship between heat wave and increased all-cause mortality. And then we discussed at different forums. We went to the policymakers, and Odisha is one of the states with extreme weathers here, heat wave in the summer season and in rainy season floods. So, and then we did advocacy with the state government, and we developed a state heat wave action plan. Actually, it has happened in 2 states, in Gujarat and Odisha. So IIPH Gandhinagar and IIPH Bhubaneswar jointly did this. And we developed this document with SOPs and how to deal with the heat wave, what are the heat-related infrastructure, which is sensitive and which can make harm to the people. Also prepare the health facilities to tackle the extreme cases suffered from heat wave, and also the community health communication with the communities to take the self-care. And then based on this, so government organized, they said that we want to our district officials train on this. And then we, in practice, we did the training of district officials in implementing heat wave action plans. So we do this training every year in the month of January, February, because the heat starts here from March, April, May, and June. So this is the way we took research, its utility, from evidence generation to advocacy to practice. This is one way of looking at the research. There is another way. It starts from practice, then advocacy, and then evidence generation. So in this, what we did, working with communities, identify their problem, like we identified problem of heat on informal women worker. They do not have the safety nets and difficult to follow the instructions because employment and resource generation is important for them. So many times they do not take care, or there are no facilities available for them to take rest or to be prevent from heat wave and harmful effects of heat. So what we did is that generally the government agencies, they do not invest in research. So we have to find the other ways. There are few agencies like Indian Council of Medical Research, they do invest in research, or Directorate of Health Research, they do invest in research. But we need to find donors and appraise them and convince them to fund this research to address the issue of heat and informal and its effect on informal women workers. So we have to use all our tools of advocacy and communication, bring communities and these donors together. There are CSR, corporate social responsibility funds available, and this research will directly benefit the communities. And then now we have planned evidence generation, measure the heat impacts on health of informal women worker to provide gender sensitive health action plan. So whatever we have developed a state action plan, it was a kind of limitation that it has not a component of gender sensitivity. So we need to have a gender sensitivity heat action plan. So based on this, we will develop again gender sensitive heat action plan. Again, go back to previous cycle, that evidence to advocacy to practice. Then there might be different solution. It's not just training, maybe health communication or some facilities making available by the government or the employers for the safety of those women. So this is another cycle. So like, if for discussion I have developed this diagram, this in Australia-India research collaboration framework, they say promote, support, and translate. So we need to promote from both sides, evidence generation, advocacy, and practice. And another way is that practice, you need to be closely associated with the communities, then do advocacy for the funder, and then evidence generation. So in the first part, this part, we listen to the communities and understand their problems to bring the evidence, have an evidence-based policy. In another cycle, we do conversation with the communities. So first, listen to the communities, be aware of the communities, and then interact with the communities, talk to them, have interaction with them. So this way, and for this, suppose we are at a practice track, so we are seen at the communities. So most of the time what happens, researchers, they go in the communities with their own domain, and then it makes fragmentation of the whole research agenda. So understand the problem of the communities as a whole, and then when you understand the problem as a whole, then you need definitely multidisciplinary team to address that. So we need environmental specialist, you need an epidemiologist, you need a social scientist, all these three together. So it promotes the multidisciplinary when we understand the problem. Not like you are targeting TB or you are targeting leprosy, you have one disease in your mind and you work on that. But disease itself is not alone in the body. It has multiple prongs and multiple factors, like we discussed about the social determinants. So it needs a multidisciplinary approach. One, we need to listen to the communities. Two, we need advocacy with the funder donor agencies for the research. We need different type of researchers involved in that, and then you need to take this evidence. Otherwise, it's wastage of resources. You take this evidence to the government or the concerned agencies, and then translate into the action plans and practices, ultimately benefiting the communities. So multidisciplinary research, your competencies to communicate with the donors, your competencies to communicate with the government agencies, all this is required. And for this, you need a team approach, which is multidisciplinary. So this way, I thought this way we can promote, support, and translate the research. So this is my say on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kadam. It's really interesting for me, the work that you've done with the women workers. It reminds me of the work that I've done with marginalised women in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, daily wage labourers, and the challenges that they face in their work, and the insecurity of their work and their income. And if it's hot, they've got to work. If they're sick, they've got to work. But also how that might translate to Australia, thinking about the gig economy, people who work, just for cash, we would say under the table, cleaners, drivers, people that are in service industries as well, and the risks to them and the insecurity about that work as well is really interesting. I'm going to hand over to Nathan to facilitate a final session with some feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Thanks for leading us through today's sessions. I found them very interesting. They're obviously areas that we don't always consider in some of our scientific areas of research. I think it's really good to look at Indigenous systems, and we have experience in the room from both Australia and India, so that's been good as well. So we've reached the program now where we should pause and look at some critical reflections on what we've talked about. It's an opportunity to step back and consider what you've heard, or to have insights into other areas that relate to today's discussion as well. But basically, it guides us in developing the Australia-India Research Collaboration Framework, which the Australia-India Institute is working on, and Dr. Priya is helping lead that from the Australia-India Institute. I might also reintroduce our two colleagues back to the discussion platform, back to the platform. We don't have a platform today, but Dr. Shailaja Seshadri and Associate Professor Tamara McKean. Be good to have you spotlighted as well, so we can get your reflections on what you've heard today. Actually, I might start with you, if that's okay, Dr. Shailaja Seshadri. Do you have any other comments on the breakout or the discussions that were happening or the sessions today?
Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the breakout session, but from what I heard from the summary, I think this discussion on methodology was particularly something that I found very interesting, especially this idea of using a participatory research methodology. At the center where I am, the Ramani Swami Center, we've been working a lot on building participatory methodologies, using theatre, using other kinds of ways and bringing people together in culturally relevant or culturally appropriate ways. And we find that we can have very authentic conversations as a result of that. And I think that really could be a way that we could work together to try and see different kinds of methodologies that have been used in the field. How can they be integrated into a larger framework of using participatory research and kind of bringing it into the mainstream? Because I think there's a lot of quantitative research, and sometimes participatory and participatory action research gets kind of pushed to the side. That is one of the things. The other thing I would say is, yes, there is some amount of increasing interest in looking at traditional ways of doing things and kind of trying to understand it, theorize about it, etc. But I think it is still very much bringing in the relationship is still very unequal. That's what I'm trying to say, between the people who want to do the theorizing and the people that they want to study and theorize about, and how to bridge that gap. I think those are also, participatory research is one way of doing it, but surely there are other ways of approaching this issue. And I think it's important to be able to think that through in a collaborative manner, and in that also cross-cultural way.
Yeah. No, thanks, Shailaja. There was a lot of discussion in our group about different alternative methodologies, particularly when you're discussing or exploring or researching Indigenous health systems. And yeah, often we're measuring the wrong things sometimes, and holistic health or social well-being is often hard to measure. We try and look for quantifiable things to measure, which don't always reflect the impact of that social system or the social cohesion. They're all very difficult things to measure, and you can't just measure it with normal quantitative measures. So I think it's a lot of the Indigenous health systems that have been used have probably been have been studied using double-blinded, randomized controlled trials, they just don't stack up. It takes away some of the social engagement with it, the belief aspect in it. It doesn't really capture the impact. So thank you, Shailaja, for those comments. Tamara, what about any comments from your side on today's session?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, and thanks, everyone. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversations in the main as well as the breakout forums. I think there's three things I'd like to put back to the group. The first one, I think, is about the importance of identifying the champions or the change makers, be it as it relates to working with community, what it might mean when you're working with policymakers, but also in terms of, trying to change practice with clinicians. Those sorts of things, I think we need to be able to identify where those change makers are, because those are the spaces that we want to perhaps put a little bit more spotlight on, or to nurture those particular relationships that might be the ones in restricted funding circumstance that, an investment in relationships with change makers might be something to consider. Just to reiterate the need for multiple methodology, I think we are moving beyond that. There is a lot more nationally as well as globally around notions of data sovereignty, which is more than just quantitative data. But if we're gathering information from people, then what are the safeguards that they have about how that information is used? And particularly from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective, we are not interested in epidemiological voyeurism. We're not interested in deficit framing about who we are. And we do understand, the way in which we can use data to meet our needs. So just because it's something that might not seem to be something that people are engaged in, it doesn't mean that there's not capacity there. And then lastly, the notion of, where are the transdisciplinary research opportunities? Because there's clearly a lot. Public health naturally grows across sectors and disciplines. The opportunities to, perhaps draw and pull funds in funding limited environments is probably something to be considered across sectors, and maybe looking at that in a way that extends those opportunities for strategic thinking. So like if there's an opportunity to look at the strategic way to be transdisciplinary in order to meet more than one endeavour that's seen as important by both Australia and India from a research perspective. So they're my thoughts towards the end of the session. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. I don't have much to add, but a couple of the stories come to mind that I think maybe highlight the importance of Indigenous knowledge, but also help us to look at from a balanced perspective. One story is obviously kangaroo care. I'm from Australia, so kangaroo care, we like to claim that, but actually we can't. It was the idea of having the baby being nursed and close to the mother came from Bogota in Colombia in the 1970s, where there was a very high infant mortality rate. And they decided that this was a traditional practice they were using in their area, that skin-to-skin contact, and it was very effective at reducing the infant mortality rate, and it's been adopted worldwide now. It's sort of standard practice in many countries. But it came from Indigenous knowledge in that setting. But I think the balance of it also, working in rural North India for 20 years, is around the treatment of measles, which a lot of children in India died because of traditional approaches to treating measles that were not informed by science. There's a balancing act. Typically, with kids with measles, that the lesions were allowed to basically become pussy and not clean because they didn't want to clean what was the gods coming out of the system. In effect, there's still knowledge and there's still beliefs that are held in our area. So no cleaning and restricting fluids So there's a balancing act, I think, in these areas where sometimes we need to consider how Indigenous knowledge can be used and should be used in our systems, but there's a blending where we can use other more non-traditional methodologies and practices to inform our healthcare. But yeah, I think on the whole, we have, by and large, to our peril, probably excluded Indigenous or traditional health models in our healthcare, and it's been from a very allopathic approach. We've tended to exclude knowledge that actually is very helpful in improving the health and contributing to sustainable, healthy communities. I'll want to hand back now to Emma and Shailaja to give us any closing remarks and ways we can follow up beyond this call. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nathan. Emma, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'll just offer some of my final reflections and then I'll hand over to Shailaja to close. Thank you so much to everyone for your input. You've given us a lot to consider as we write up our recommendations and report for the framework. Some of the things that I think will take me a little bit longer to keep considering and understanding, going back to the first session around people and ecosystems. And I get very focused on people and participation, and I can't help but be an occupational therapist. So I think about the things that people do. And yes, that exists within an environment, but the environment stuff isn't always front of mind for me. And so thinking bigger about place and identity and belonging within a community, within a setting, and within an ecosystem, it's going to take me a little bit more time to really consider those things that were shared in the first session. And connected governance was something that Tamara talked about as well, and how we honour different knowledge perspectives and sovereignty, and I think influences how we can sustain healthy communities and how we might design research that is inclusive. And I really liked the point around sense of self and others as almost the opposite of disunity. And I think society's becoming really polarized. And if we really want to sustain healthy communities, we've got to find ways for people to come back together and be in an interface. And as we write up this framework, thinking about how can we recommend strategies that promote, support, and translate research that brings people and communities together. That's big ideas that I really appreciate the stimulating thought, and thanks everybody for making me think bigger about those things.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. And I would like to echo what Emma said in terms of the learnings from this workshop. For me personally, I've learned a lot looking at things with very different perspective. I thought that when India and Australia are working together, let's say through this workshop, then I thought that there's so many differences in the country. India and Australia, the way they are, the size of the country, of course, they're both big countries, but culturally there are lots of differences, economically, etc. But then it also amazes me that they're also very similar in terms of the issues that came up here that we discussed, the issues around disasters and the issues on community resilience, the stories, the recovery, and their narratives, and the power of storytelling that's there, the power of relying on social capital. So these are the things that are very similar in India as well as Australia, and that came up repeatedly, as well as the difficulties with research collaborations in terms of early research careers, and how do we bring together, support, as well as promote, as well as sustain and translate research activities into various things. So all these things came out, which made me realize that this is such an important event in terms of the workshop and how it connects back to the framework and how that will be developed. So I would like to say that I learned a lot. I hope you did too in this workshop. And I would like to thank with all my heart to the Australia-India Institute for giving us an opportunity to co-lead this, Emma and myself, for this workshop. I would like to thank Professor Priya, Dr. Shailaja, Dr. Kadam, Professor McKean, Dr. Eliza, and it was very important, Professor Nathan Grills, for facilitating and helping us with this workshop. And we couldn't have done it without the support of Brianna. So thank you, Brianna. And I would like to thank all the participants for their very good inputs that we got from this, which will help us feed back into the framework itself, and for giving us various ideas that we will be able to put back into the framework as well as build it further.